Asian view of Nietzsche. Military juntas, war crimes. The great Thai Empire and the dictator who forced officials to go to schools of traditional Thai dances. All this madness was in the history of Thailand, but you usually don't hear about it. No, if your plane lands in Thailand, and you suddenly, instead of visiting snow-white beaches, riding a scooter through the jungle, and smoking something absolutely legal under a palm tree, suddenly decide for some mysterious reason to take an interest in local history, then you will find a discovery that thousands of tourists have made before you. Thais are very proud of their history, especially against the background of their neighbors, because Thailand has never been colonized. This is the most important bond. It is the object of Thailand's national pride, with which almost any conversation about the Thai past begins. And the main reason that the fate of this country did not fall on the shoulders of a white man during the colonial period is simple. Thailand is incredibly, fantastically, fabulously lucky. Firstly, it was lucky that in the era of the redistribution of the world by white men in cork helmets, Thailand, then here and there, suddenly found itself exactly between British Burma and French Vietnam. And by the middle of the 19th century, both monsieur and gentlemen had too many other worries. Some had a project in full swing to name an entire epic in honor of our queen, while others had a real political tragicomedy going on in general, the reign of Napoleon III. In short, it was somehow not with their hands to fight, and for what? And yes, that's the second thing. There simply wasn't about a damn thing. For the most part, the country consisted of jungles, jungles in the mountains, and jungles on the coast. So if you are a colonial empire in search of resources and markets, and not a desperate fan of Jumanji, then there was nothing much for you to do there. It was much more practical to leave these territories as a buffer zone. Hello everyone, I am Yeager Ziryanov, and you are on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead, and the dead, about history. And let's figure out today what was going on there in this Thailand, which is not only proud of the fact that the colonizer never set foot there, which is not quite true, to put it mildly, but also manages to declare that Thailand never participated in World War II. Although its government literally cooperated with the Imperial Army in the 40s, Japan, and was in a military alliance with them. How did this happen? What is this all about? Let's find out. The fact is that the modern Thai historical narrative is actually an illustration from the dictionary, my friends. And the illustration is, by the way, cunning. Yes, because in fact it cannot be said that Siam really escaped any colonizers and colonization. It's just not true. Yes, it did not become a colony, but at the end of the 19th century, it still ceded part of the territory to the French. In the 67th year, King Rama IV will renounce the sovereign rights to his part of Cambodia. And, by the way, if you think that wow, what villains these Frenchmen are, then don't worry, he conquered these lands himself. And quite recently. The British did not even need territorial concessions, except for one episode in the early 20th century, with the division of the Malay principalities by Siam, in which, of course, no one asked the Malays themselves what they thought about it at all. In any case, back in 1855, the British signed a treaty of friendship and trade with Vietnam. Friendship boiled down to the following. The Siamese court became a mandatory link in the Anglo-Indian opium trade in the country, and the British received in return just a bunch of all sorts of hanging buns. In addition to the right of free trade and the right to purchase real estate, they received an extraterritorial status. That is, a British subject. Being on the territory of Siam, think about it, was in the legislative and judicial jurisdiction, not of Siam, but of the British Empire. Any adventurer from the vast expanses of this very empire, once in Bangkok, simply became inviolable. No one could do anything with him in the legal field, but the Siamese king retained the opportunity to get money for drugs. And yes, although I understand that now your ears are probably even moving from injustice, I must still note that in many ways, this has turned into positive consequences. No, I know that the British did all sorts of tin in their various colonies. I am the last person who is going to justify the empire. But the fact is that even the most terrible injustice can actually turn into something completely unexpected. So friends, it's time for a really important and cool integration. Because it's about the opportunity for you to work, for example, with us, and with dozens of other cool bloggers, and earn very decent money at the same time. And I'm not kidding or exaggerating right now, but I'm just saying that the author's media are the guys who are engaged, for example, in all of our advertising, looking for new sales calls, that is, sales managers. I love the guys very much. They helped us bring the channel to a new level, both in production and advertising. So I declare with responsibility that they are cool. This is a great opportunity. Firstly, for example, because some of the agents we work with often earn no less than these very bloggers of yours. No, seriously. Often their commission can reach up to 30% of the transaction amount, and for some bloggers, as you understand, it can be, well, a very impressive amount. And secondly, the guys have all the processes set up superbly. You can work from anywhere in the world, the best boil in the world. Yes, that's right, there is no one, and just a great team. No, really, if you know how to sell, if you understand marketing, active sales, or you are ready to break into this sphere with your feet, and you are also self-disciplined, then I conjure you this chance is very steep. There is no salary here, as much as you have earned, so much you have earned. The advertiser and the transaction are charged to you. Full-time employment here, but believe me, it pays off. I personally know many of the guys from the authors, and in general they all feel good. In short, the dudes have a free schedule, full loyalty to the remote, excellent opportunities for growth and earnings. And also the opportunity to work with really cool people. In general, consider this my personal recommendation. Follow the link at the bottom of the description, fill out the questionnaire, and send it. You will be contacted. Here, and we return to our topic. Look, for almost the entire 19th century, Siam, to put it mildly, was at the bottom of the bottom. Yes, it is believed that it was several monarchs of that time who became reformers, modernized the country, raised it from its knees, and did not let the damned Western conquerors devour it. But you have already understood how it was with the last point. With everything else, it was about the same. At best, the Thai monarchy did not interfere with modernization, or carried it out either pointwise or forcibly. Here is the elder brother of the aforementioned Rama IV, Rama number 3, is considered to be the person who resurrected contacts with the West and, accordingly, one of these Atlantans who stood at the beginning of the transformation of Siam into a modern state. But his main modernization project is really just an attempt. Modernize your army according to the European model in order to frighten your neighbors. This is actually a very typical thing. We once talked about it in a separate video, look at it. It turned out to be a nightmare for the neighbors. In other words, after many years of wars, he still received some share of power over Cambodia. So what's the end result? Rama IV is considered the author of Siamese sovereignty and the defender of independence. Well, I've just said everything about that. But they made a musical about him. And only the next of these so-called great kings of Siama, Rama number 5, really began to carry out real reforms. But even here, it is important to make a reservation. You see, I don't really want to underestimate the dignity of all these majesties of theirs. Although I really think that a good half of the rulers from the Chakra dynasty thought about anything about family glory, about personal wealth, about strengthening power, but not about the fate of the people entrusted to them by the higher powers. No, the point here is that even if at least half of these people cared, Siam remained perhaps the worst soil for planting the seeds of progress there until the 60s of the 19th century. All foreign trade is in the hands of the state, read, the royal family. Primitive agrarian economy, colossal scale of legal slavery, and total comprehensive lack of education. In fact, most of the country lived in small families who collected rice in order to hand it over as taxes. And the main entertainment was the opportunity to die in a royal war somewhere in the neighboring jungle for the sake of greatness. No, well, there were still weddings. In the plural, because polygamy. And as you know, it is simply impossible to overcome all this kingdom of rice despondency by stamping the royal foot and issuing a decree to everyone to live well from now on and forever. Economic and social changes are needed. Society needs to start changing. so that it starts learning something, producing something, exchanging something, and so on. But how could the society of the Xiamo change if it consisted, in fact, entirely of illiterate and poor slaves and peasants, who could hardly even save something, let alone change? That's right. Foreigners have become the fuel for the modernization of Siam. And it's not even only and not so much about the British, suddenly, as the Chinese. By the 50s, there were about 300,000 of them on the territory of Siam. Many migrants were already there in the second generation, and the government simply could not cope with them. Chinese emigrants organized their communities, traded, opened businesses, created logistics, and so on. Apparently, for many of them in the 19th century, scene seemed to be a calmer place, full of opportunities. Unlike their great homeland, where historical events were always boiling. At the same time, their communities sometimes became so strong and independent that the Siamese government actually had to use troops to regain control over some territories. And they also had to, well, modernize the administrative system, somehow develop and improve it. Because the old patterns of dialogue in the spirit of the feudal peasant did not work very well with these people. By the way, who do you think has spied our expensive sessions on the entire administrative system? From British India. Because they probably treated their lands in much the same way as the British treated their colonies. Probably worse. I'm not sure. Social innovations have been added to administrative and commercial innovations. Previously, family ties were the main connections of all, but now trade and professional ones came out in advance. Small traditional communities began to change, the flow of Chinese was quickly joined by flows of Burmanians and Indonesians from European colonies, and all of them together began to master the untilled Siamese frontier. Many former peasants became townspeople, and the main city was obviously Bangkok, with its huge river port, which, by the way, did not become the capital immediately. However, most of the urban economy was developed either by the British or by the nobility, who began to Europeanize. The rest of the migration was much more important for the development of other parts of the country, which ceased to look like a set of post-apocalyptic huts, where it is difficult to marry someone other than your cousin. But all this could not work in the conditions of widespread slavery, which the Siam monarchy really coped with. And she did it quite elegantly, honestly. Here's my respect, hats off, it was pretty cool. They did not abruptly abolish slavery, instead they introduced taxes on slavery, so that slaveholders would have some personal economic motivation to change something in their lives, and in the lives of their slaves. At the beginning of the 20th century, slavery will, of course, be abolished completely and irrevocably, but until that moment, decades of gradual adaptation of society and institutions to this new wonderful life, full of freedom, will pass. And it actually turned out to be a pretty practical solution, a little cynical, to put it mildly, but nevertheless effective. When slavery is finally banned, there will be very few slaves in the country. And just imagine, the beginning of the 20th century. Siamese women began to wear hats and cover their breasts. Yes, I know, sometimes you have to pay a high price for civility. No, go to Europe en masse, get a fashionable education, and hang out on the banks of the Thames and the Seine. A new promising bourgeoisie is raising its head in the country. Even the flag with an elephant, and that was replaced with a tricolor. Well, how can something go wrong? Well, in general, it can. By the 30s, Thais will finally enter, so to speak, the wrong door, into the wide-open gates of the world of chauvinistic nationalism. But how could all these enlightened people allow this to happen? It's terrible. Well, at least, because it is not necessary to overestimate the economic and social transformation of Siam. Yes, capitalism has appeared in the country. Yes, the bourgeois have appeared in the country. But the bourgeois, you know, it sounds very pompous. And in fact, they were all the owners of small rice farms, who often even made tools for themselves. No, of course, this is all a big step forward, compared to the horrors of the slave-owning system of the past. But yes, you know, political consciousness among, so to speak, the broad masses of the people is still somehow far away. Moreover, the fate of those who nevertheless drowned, for these progressive democratic values of yours, by the way. These people were far from coming from the people was quite unenviable. At least no one listened to these people. One of the later kings of Siam directly stated that the country was not ready for the constitution. And the attempt of the officers' democratic coup of 1912 ended with a series of executions and arrests, without even actually starting. This coup is important to mention not by itself, but to understand that the future fate of the country was determined in general by a rather narrow circle of people. This is the officers, this is the aristocracy, and members of the royal family. And actually, strictly speaking, even this already indicated that there was more freedom in the country. Because until recently, for example, only members of the royal family could sit in the royal council. And now all sorts of boyars were allowed there. Progress. But, as you understand correctly, in such conditions, it is still easier to get a nationalist-minded military junta than a normal republic. Even if republican ideas would dominate among these people. In the 32nd year, Rama VII will still be forced to give up absolute power. There were, in general, two main reasons for the revolution. The first is the traditional conflict of individuals with the monarchy, against the background of the strengthening of the absolutist trend. The more power the monarch wrung out for himself, the less everyone else understood, but somehow. We don't live here in the 18th century, after all. Well, the second half is the economic crisis that broke out in the country, and was one of the many consequences of, yes, you understood correctly, the Great Depression. By the way, we have a separate video about her, if not yet. And in particular, the abolition of the gold standard by Britain, Thailand's main trading partner, with the subsequent depreciation of the pound and a sharp decline in the income of Thai rice exporters. And, oh my God, just look at this photo. These guys, who yesterday ran away from their couples in Paris to the Seine embankment to drink beer, now determined what kind of country would be in the future. In other words, do you understand how narrow a layer could change anything at all? Yes, it was literally a group of student military officers studying in Paris. Having carried out a coup in the 32nd year, they proudly declared that now power belongs to the people, according to the fresh constitution. Of these people, we are interested in two. Progressive Social Democrat cum, Panamian K, and harsh national nut twister Phibin San Kram. Good guy and bad guy, rebel and Darth Vader. The left stick is Twix and the right one. Well, you understand. The chronology of the first few years after the revolution of the 32nd is generally quite confusing, but in short, during a series of local conspiracies, our good guy was temporarily suspended from business. And the government was headed by the military, suppressing both royalists and Democrats. Among the military, the bad guy, Phibin San Kramp, won the intraspecific struggle. He won a special election on the occasion of the resignation of the government cabinet in the 38th year, and aimed to become nothing less than an Asian Mussolini. How did you win the election? He took the place of the winner through intrigue and personal influence. The real winner of the elections refused to take power. And you're like, well, Yegorka, well, what's a bad guy right away? Well, what about the dictator right away? There used to be horror and nightmare, there was political chaos, there was an absolutist monarchy. Well, what is it? Well, something so abrupt to him right away. And I will answer you that if there was a brothel in your rented apartment before you, it does not make the fact that you are walking around Vienna any better. Having received the coveted post in the 38th year, Phibin immediately sent a man to jail. So 100 of the most influential elites, 12 people were executed, completely cleaned up the political field, made the monarch's power final, completely formal, and appointed himself minister of everything in general. Seriously, he became not only the prime minister, but also the head of the army, the minister of defense, and the minister of internal affairs, then also the minister of foreign affairs, but you understand. He filled the rest of the cabinet with loyal military men. 33% of the budget immediately began to go to the army. And he will, in general, soon dissolve the parliament, and in the 40th. He will drag through such a small amendment to the legislation that will allow him to remain in office legally. Create an opportunity for another 10 years. And this is not all the charms of his regime. I'll talk about it a little later. In the meantime, I want to say that it is much more important to understand not the technical details of the political disorder that preceded his coming to power, but why in general. Among all these officers who received a kind of European progressive education, the highest nobility were dominated by ideas, well, To put it mildly, not of the most humanistic kind, but frankly speaking, nationalist chauvinistic. Far-right and authoritarian. But you get it. To begin with, it was from the Europeans that these people learned all this nationalism. Back in the 90s, there was a small Franco-Siamese war, as a result of which the Monsieur took away the territories of Laos. And argumentatively, this aggression was quite interesting. They say that Lao is a separate pure race, but the Thais are too mixed up with the Chinese. So the power of the Thais is the so-called Lilliputian oligarchy. And to take away a part of the lands from these dirty-blooded midgets natives means to liberate the racially integral Lao peoples living on them. Thank you, the French. And yes, it didn't seem to you, this whole racial theory sounds one-in-one, like that racist nonsense from the Elysium disc. But the truth is that at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe, there really was a very mainstream idea that a nation is a political continuation of a race. And very quickly, the Siamese courtiers, young officers who had not studied in London and Paris, quickly realized that this game could be played together. In Westerns, nationalism was mainstream. And he became so with everyone, where literally the entire 19th century was spent in discussions about the nation, ethnicity, and, of course, race. And do not think that the military, having come to power, suddenly turned out to be evil fascists. There were enough reasons for radical right discourse. This is the absolute conviction of all late monarchs, that the people had not yet developed before democracy. And the traditionalist absolutism that grew out of it, relying on Buddhist institutions and so on. And then there is also the lack of widespread interest among the people in these parliamentarisms and democracies of yours. Well, after all, in the end, everyone really healed better than their fathers and grandfathers. And, of course, the closest example of Asian success is Japanese. And yes, we will laugh about Thailand's connection with Japan a little later. And there was also resentment towards the West and resentment among individuals. After all, remember, Cambodia has always been a truly Thailand. Well, the reactionary response to the unsuccessful coup of the early 20th century, in the form of tightening the screws, is also worth considering. A separate point, of course, is the wild fatigue from the dominance of foreigners. First of all, the British and the Chinese. But somehow no one wanted to think that we should thank these guys for destroying traditional institutions and helping to establish capitalism. That's somehow not what they were thinking about. Well, because it is clear, yes, that, first of all, everyone began to live better thanks to His Majesty, his wise deeds, and all his wise ancestors. This is clear to the monitor lizard. And secondly, why do these Chinese of yours live on average better and richer than the locals? And it doesn't even matter that often these same Chinese, to be honest, are local themselves, already in the second or third generation, if not longer. Xenophobia has reached the ridiculous and terrible. Rama VI, the king at the beginning of the 20th century, compared the Chinese with the Jews. He called them the Jews of Asia, referring to the absolutely anti-Semitic European agenda. In other words, he meant that these are social parasites who do not want to integrate into Thai society and become normal Thais and carriers of Thai culture. As you understand, we are all anti-Semitism here, and we do not approve of such things in the Redroom. In general, from the point of view of Thai nationalists, the Chinese were even worse than the Jews, I'm sorry. Because, they say, the Jews don't have their own state, so they poisoned the lives of others, but the Chinese actually have. And so they let them go there, all such bastards, and go. In short, it is not surprising that Ibn San Krak, literally a fan of Mussolini, who came to power in the 38th, really enjoyed support. And his regime was not just a boring military junta. Oh no. They took seriously the task of building a new right-wing and correct ideology there. Fman had a friend from Parisian Times Widget, the same chief ideologue of the country I mentioned, and, by the way, is also a fan of Mussolini. Yes, these guys were original. Usually guys like them sing hosannas to the Austrian, or His Majesty Hirohito, but there is no Mussolini. I think there are a number of reasons for this, which at the same time shed light on the ideology of nationalist Thailand. Well, for example, I put forward the thesis that Thais are a race of warriors. And even the very shape of the country symbolically proves this. The shape of the axe. Yes, it's an axe. And I'm not kidding right now. Apparently, the worship of Mussolini is also explained by this. He probably, when he looked at the map of Italy, also decided that it was the shape of an axe, just well in the other direction. you will learn how to travel in different directions in different hemispheres. In addition, the choice of the main object for imitation was probably made on the basis of some gastronomic customs. After all, Italians eat what? They eat pasta, they eat pasta. But Hive and Prime Minister Fibbin were very concerned about the issue of noodles. And I'm not just talking about the noodles on the ears of their subjects. Fibbin himself was very fond of eating noodles. And he and his government were very worried about the amount of protein consumed by the people. After all, Thais are just warriors, and they have to eat something so that the muscles grow. Sankrak in the 38th year said that the population should grow to 40 million. And it is necessary that people become taller and stronger, so the distribution of a new recipe for noodles with shrimp, nuts, and all this other stuff among street food vendors has become a real state project. And again, I'm not kidding. And yes, it is this recipe that is a well-known pad thai for all of us. So, friends, your favorite Asian piggy is an invention of Thai fashion of the 30s. The Fchi also preached, of course, the idea of purity of language, its own special form of nihilism. Here he wrote that everyone should produce a human revolution within himself. He really believed that few people are capable of this, mostly only the upper classes, and therefore they are the highest, but nevertheless. They say that every person should have the freedom to serve the state, society, and the people. And you understand, in general, the motivation to become better for the sake of the great Thai idea and the great Thai race. Because the special identity of the Thai race is also a thing that Hive preached. Or which it doesn't matter. I don't give a damn, to be honest. The popularization of PADTAY was part of the cultural mandates that were needed. Not only because the Hive Fibbins dreamed of sharing ingenious recipes, but because in fact, they needed a basis for creating a national identity. Habits, traditions, national history, national cuisine, and so on. Firstly, it somehow helped to rally the people, and secondly, it created narratives in the spirit of we are Thais, we are special, we are belligerent, we are the strongest, and the rest of Indochina therefore need to obey us. Because this is our culture, it is the oldest and most developed. Hive literally declared that Bangkok pancake to China is Athens for Greece, the cradle of culture and civilization. And this, by the way, is another important reason why xenophobia has become a staple. The Chinese not only often overtook the Thais in terms of wealth or business and entrepreneurship, but also broke down this concept of Thai identity, Thai racial identity, sorry. And this is ironic, because many Chinese did not just go to the south, they went to other Chinese who had already lived in this south for a very long time. My God, yes, the Chinese brought this very noodles, from which they will make this unfortunate pad thai. Ethnic Chinese lived in the lower reaches of the Chao River region before the city of Bangkok appeared on its banks. And yet, being Thai apart from everyone else, from all these Chinese and others, has become the most important bond, as well as the narrative about the fact that Thailand has never been colonized. On this spiritual core, the carcass of Thai political consciousness began to be planted also in the late 30s. And yes, the very word Thailand, Protsantai, the land of the free, is also an invention of the regime of a Phibit Sankrak. But the word Siam, in principle, has always been exclusively a foreign name, so it's not surprising. What's interesting here is that it even adds etymology. The word Siam managed to tie itself under the ideology, to use as such a type of casus belli. But I'd rather write about it in detail in the cart. Subscribe to it, by the way, if you still haven't done so. Right there, we constantly have all sorts of cool materials, texts, notes, cupcakes, and all sorts of historical stories coming out, so. And, actually, it would seem that everything is clear with this chauvinistic ideology. Well, how would it be surprising that Thailand eventually drifted into the Berlin-Tokyo axis? It wouldn't be like that, because back in the 30s, at the end in the sense of the 30s, not everyone understood it. On the eve of World War II, Thailand was sitting on two chairs at once, and in the Allies' chair with cigars, and on a Japanese zabuton with katanas. On the eve of the Second World War, Churchill spent the rest of his life, by the way, we recently made a separate video, corresponded with Sank. And when Japanese troops land on the shores of Thailand in the 41st year, the British Prime Minister will send a message, say, "Defend yourself. An attack on you is like an attack on ourselves." And this attempt to negotiate with the Thai dictator probably may seem silly. Because yes, Siama traditionally had the deepest trade and other ties with England, and diplomatic contacts, and anything. But, as you remember, they did not appear from a good life. And since the 20s, when the monarchy finally turned into the mainstream of absolutism, and even more so by the end of the 30s, when the military took power, Thailand has only been increasing trade turnover with Germany and Japan. The rhetoric of the Abhiban Sankrik regime was chauvinistic, unifying, and imperial. What did Churchill want to negotiate with the Thai dictator about? Well, however, as we will see, this story knows its contracts with the devil. In general, you see, the Second World War for Thailand began not with the Japanese invasion, but with the defeat of the French. Until the 40th year, the Thais took a position of non-interference. In June of the 40th, Paris fell. France was divided into the German-occupied and the Vichy government. By the way, we shot a separate detailed video about him. Then it became clear that the French, who did not even hold their capital, were unlikely to be able to keep their colonies. In September, Japanese troops enter French Indochina, and in November of the 40th Thai, claiming, of course, the ancient lands of their ancestors Cambodia. And this is war, this is, forgive me, well, full of laughter. First of all, because of it, the Americans had to urgently withdraw supplies of a dozen or two bombers that were already supposed to go to Siam. This is to the question of how deftly the Thais maneuvered between different sides in general. Secondly, it's funny that the French kind of lost, but actually won. Well, in a purely technical sense, because the war on land at some point just stalled, and in the war at sea. The French Navy, of course, were much more powerful. So the gentlemen with the red-blue-white tricolor are in the first place here. But thirdly, none of this was at all important, because in the end the Japanese intervened, contacted the Vichy government, and, in fact, simply occupied the entire region. Thailand was thrown a certain amount of territories, but it is clear who actually owned control here. And fourthly, it all sounds scary and epic. Battles of the fleet, aviation, infantry in the jungle. But in fact, it was all a tiny skirmish, especially by the standards of the Second World War. On both sides there are literally a couple of hundred dead, injured, and prisoners. It's all about nothing. That, however, did not prevent the Hibban from arranging an incredible victory celebration with parades, and the erection of the obligatory victory monument, which, by the way, is still quietly sticking out in the middle of the Thai capital, even without particularly annoying anyone's eyes. Although, of course, I would generally make this mem a symbol of this military, so to speak, company. And let's go back to Churchill's ill-fated message with a call to fight against the Japanese. By the 41st year, after all, Sankrik suddenly had an idea. Germany-Japan turns out to be right on very strong. And Japan is also very close. And the Americans, then still a great neutral, for some reason no longer want to give Thai weapons. The Thais urgently began to beg for weapons from the United States again, but it was too late. The Japanese in January of the 41st offered them a choice of three incredibly different options. Allow Japanese troops to pass through their territory to the borders of British Burma and Malaya. Allow Japanese troops to pass through their territories to the borders of Burma and Malaya and support them logistically. Or let Japanese troops pass to the borders of British Burma and Malaya, support them logistically. And also conclude a military alliance with Japan. Well, maybe there was also a sarcasm response option. While Phibin was thinking about all this incredible offer, the Japanese took and arranged a landing. The Thais did not really understand what to do with it, reluctantly shot back for several hours, but soon the boss woke up and ordered to raise his paws up in front of his dear ally. Yes, then an official as well as a formal military alliance was concluded between Japan and Thailand. On paper, an equal, but in fact turned talent into a Kika Japan website, while on Thai radio, they talked about the greatness of the Thai Empire and the Thai race. Probably, Phibin Sankrak did not really want to choose this option. And in general, choose. Apparently, he was satisfied with spinning between the sides, so he thought for a long time, and Churchill sent him telegrams. But in the end, it turned out as it turned out. Probably, he decided that he just couldn't resist the Japanese, well, stupidly. And already in January of the 42nd, Thailand will declare war on Great Britain and the United States. And in fairness, perhaps this project of an alliance with the Japanese could even seem realistic to a Thai. The allies in the region were really bad at that time. The Americans were defeated in the Philippines, and the British gloomily counted the losses in the defense of Singapore. Well, then there was the Second World War, which I obviously won't retell to you. And with regard to Thailand, it is worth saying, of course, that it is used to be perceived as such a mere springboard for Japanese troops, as such a Kika support site. But it is not necessary to limit him in historical glory, even if it is unkind. Because, for example, he managed to participate in many battles as part of the Imperial Army during the campaign in Burma. And it would not be too significant, but the Thais managed, of course, to commit war crimes. And the most famous of them is, of course, the construction of the Thai-Burma Railway, the logistical artery for servicing the forces of the Imperial Army during the Burmese campaign was called the Death Road, because during its construction, more than 200,000 people died from exploitation and inhumane conditions. Mostly, of course, prisoners of war. But there was also such a, let's say, positive twist in all this, because in all this mess of Thais in World War II, there was one character who quite hastily disowned all this villainy. Well, more precisely, there may have been many such people, but first of all one is important for us, a socialist, a Democrat, a participant in the revolution of the 32nd year, a former Parisian. Students. And yes, you understand me correctly, the regent of the minor king. Yes, by the way, I remind you that if a miracle, yes Jura, Thailand has remained a kingdom all this time. It's just that at the time, so to speak, when Phiban came to power, His Majesty was 9 years old, he lived in Switzerland. He had no real power, and he had no real reasons to go home, let's just say, there was no real reason for him to go home. And yet, he was still the king. The king, do you understand? So his regent, without putting his signature under the declaration of war, got the right to claim that Thailand never entered into any World War II. And yes, this is exactly the rhetoric that the Chinese authorities adhere to these days. PADTAY created a semi-underground secret society, Free Thailand, which fought the regime with all sorts of different methods. It united mainly the elites dissatisfied with Phiban, and all this eventually resulted in a vote of no confidence in the dictator in the 44th year. This society existed, of course, with the money of the United States and Great Britain. What did you think? And if you think this is the end, then no, because the end here is much more ridiculous. In the 45th year, Thailand came out of the war, and in the 46th year, returned all the conquered territories. But the fact is that Phiban's removal occurred initially only from the Prime Minister's post, he remained Commander-in-Chief. And then he avoided any responsibility at all, because, well, it seems like they tried to try him, but there were some legal problems with how to give him the status of a war criminal. When did this status of a war criminal appear in Thai law at all? Does the law have retroactive effect? And anyway, Phiban somehow managed to temporarily disappear from the country very timely. And the funny thing is, do you know who turned out to be one of his main defenders? Panaying. Yes, the same socialist and Democrat. Well, the really fun thing here is not even that, but the fact that literally in a few years, full of political chaos and minor coup with intrigues. Yes, I feel that you have strained, and you have strained correctly, because the beloved dictator returned to power in Thailand and stayed there until the second half of the 50s. During the second term of Phiban Sangkrak, the country was a member of the UN, received rather large American tranches, and generally became a reliable ally of Washington in the Cold War. Only Thailand was less lucky than Japan, with which the story was generally similar. The Thais, as allies of the United States, were, of course, forced to start unscrewing the nuts in the 50s. And the reaction to this was another military coup. And the glorious tradition of the military Huns coming to power does not end in this country in general to this day. But, of course, it's better not to worry about this, because everyone knows that Thailand, first of all, is a country of smiles. Well, I hope that you are also entertained by this video, and if so, do not forget to like and click on the subscription. You can also write comments, by the way. And if you want to support our channel, you can do it on Patreon from a foreign card, or on Boost from a Russian one. And watch videos without ads, watch them before everyone else, chat with us in a chat. In general, well, all sorts of such different plops. You can just support us nobly, so to speak, and chivalrously. By the way, here's some info for people who always want to know what kind of movies we use. Absolutely every video has a full list of movies in the description, check it out. Adios.